Well, good morning, everybody. It's very nice to be back here and able to sort of share what's happened in the state the last 8 years. As you can see from the logo and the slides, I'm really sort of presenting this from my prior job as Director of Finance as opposed to my current job at CalPERS. So really, this is sort of like what you would have heard in September. So bear with me in terms of not representing the position of CalPERS. But let's go ahead and get started. And this chart is one of the governor's favorite because I think it really does tell the modern fiscal history of California. In terms of, if you go back to 2000, that was really when the internet and the dot-com boom was happening for the state, and everyone thought that the world had changed and that we were sort of in a post-recession world and that things were going to keep growing forever. And shortly thereafter, the dot-com market crashed, and we ended up in huge deficits, leading to Governor Davis's recall. And then just as the economy was recovering and the budget was coming back into balance in the mid-2000s, we went back into a recession, and you see the massive red bars again. And then at the back half of the chart, you really sort of see the modern Jerry Brown era where we've brought the state's budget back into balance. When we came into office, we were facing a $27 billion deficit on roughly a $90 billion budget. So just for perspective, it was sort of, we were in deficit more than 30% of what we were spending in a particular year. So, and we sort of recovered through a three-pronged attack, both spending cuts. We went to the voters to ask for a temporary tax increase, and then the recovering economy sort of helped us and has continued to propel us into balance through the rest of the period. The period of the red bars really were driven by two things. One was a short-term perspective, I think, in terms of the state's finances, that unlike the federal government, California has to balance its budget on a year-by-year basis. So there's no printing of money, there's no sort of rolling deficits over. That being said, that short-term thinking really led to a number of what is affectionately known in Sacramento as budget gimmicks that sort of were ways to delay making any decisions. You had a world in which people didn't want to cut spending, they didn't want to raise taxes, and so they looked for a third alternative, which was really borrowing and deferring costs into the future. And so that's some of why you see the extended, red bars for so many years, was that you had 1 year's deficit that was never really solved, and that you sort of pushed it into the following year and just had to deal with it again. That being said, what also was happening was that we were only focused on a year at a time. So when you looked at your budget, you were like, okay, we've got a $10, $15, $20 billion deficit this year. Let's just paper over that number and then we'll deal with next year. At the same time, you knew you had a structural shortfall that where you were spending more money long term than you were expected to bring in. And so you sort of took the prior year's deficit that you rolled over and added to it a new shortfall from that year's spending being greater than your revenues. And so you sort of ended up in this perpetual spiral where you could never bring your budget into balance. And so what I think as we came into office, really some of the key things were obviously the spending cuts and the revenue increases, but it was also a focus on getting back to the basic principle that a state government needs to balance its books, and not just for the year ahead, but really for the long term. So we instituted some multi-year planning that is now required in the Constitution, where we're looking at not only this year, but also the following 3 years. And so when you do that, and Governor Brown, to his credit, really insisted on, in budget negotiations, balancing each of those years into the future, when you start looking at a 4-year perspective, you're not able to sort of shift costs from 1 year to the next in the same way, because it's just going to hurt you the following year and doesn't really provide any benefit. So this is really kind of when people talk about the changed California economy and the changed California budget, this graphic really captures what people are talking about, that we're past the huge red deficits into a different era. People, when we came into office, talked about California as a failed state. They liked comparing us to Greece in terms of sort of a bankrupt government, which, you know, in the United States, states can't actually go bankrupt, so it wasn't really the right comparison, but it did capture the essence that people thought California was ungovernable. And certainly, as we'll talk as I go on with the rest of the slides, there remain many challenges in the state, but I think what we've shown is that things are manageable if you sort of are committed to the notion of managing and governing. With that, so let me back up a little bit to give you a little backdrop on terms of what the state budget looks like. The state general fund, which is where I'm going to spend most of my time talking about, is $139 billion now. So general fund is separate from special funds. Special funds are really those programs where you're paying a fee and getting a service and the funds are restricted. So think of your driver's license. You're paying a fee to the Department of Motor Vehicles to get your driver's license. Those funds are segregated and can't really be used for general purposes. This $139 billion is sort of general purpose money, and the legislature and the governor can decide largely how to spend it on their own. So on the left-hand side, you have where our revenues come from. On the right-hand side, you have where our money goes. So as you can see, the bulk of our money is in the personal income tax. This is sort of your the traditional taxes that you pay on April 15th based on the income you receive. It used to be that the sales tax, which is our next biggest revenue source, was much more prominent, and the same can be said for our corporation tax, our third largest. The term that people use tends to be the big three revenues, but you can see the income tax is really the big revenue in California. That represents 70% of our revenues, and sort of the state budget lives and dies on state revenues. On the spending side, you see the bulk of our money is spent on K-12 education and health and human services. So when people really focus on corrections spending or on university spending, those are much smaller than those other two areas. And many of the things that people focus on in terms of, oh, if they just cut this, you know, this program that I don't think is warranted, tends to be really small dollar amounts where you can't swing things. So in terms of your spending portfolio as a state, K-12 education and health and human services are really the big drivers. So I've got a couple extra slides that sort of focus on those two areas, and this next one is K-14 education, so adding community colleges to our K-12 education system. These numbers are driven by Proposition 98, which is a constitutional amendment that was passed in 1998 by California voters. And the more you get into the state budget, you're always going to end up talking about initiatives in some way where propositions really drive our state budget. And so school funding is driven by a formula in the state constitution that's really tied to our state revenue. So you see things were going along reasonably well in 2007-8, and then they dropped dramatically as the recession took hold and state revenues were dropping down from $56.6 billion to $47 billion. And then starting in 2012-13, we've had a dramatic rebound of school funding, coinciding with a change in the way we allocate the money. So under the state's new local control funding formula, we've eliminated dozens of categorical programs that really tied the hands of local school districts, and now they've been given huge amounts of increases up to $78.4 billion in the current fiscal year in terms of funding, where K-12 districts can spend the money largely however they see fit. And this year we've put in place a community college formula that's very similar to the K-12 formula that will give community colleges more flexibility going forward in terms of their spending. And so I mentioned that health and human services was the second largest main area of the state budget. Within that, Medi-Cal is by far the largest state program. So Medi-Cal is the state's name for the Medicaid program within that's run by the federal government, and it's really a partnership program between the state and the federal governments. You can see over the last number of years, the yellow bar, which is the state's general fund commitment, has been growing, but not particularly dramatically. That being said, the total funds, which is largely federal funds, has sort of skyrocketed to where the Medi-Cal spending has more than doubled in the last few years. And that's really driven by the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, as people like to call it. And so you see in 2014-15 the big jump, and that was the beginning of the expansion of coverage to more than 5 million Californians, where the federal government was basically paying at the front end almost the entire cost of the expansion, and slowly they're going to ratchet down those commitments. So over the last couple of years, where people have talked about eliminating the Affordable Care Act or turning it into a block grant program, that's probably the largest direct fiscal risk that the state faces. When a couple of years ago we were seeing proposals, you were in essence looking at a shift from the federal government to the state general fund of $25 to $30 billion every single year of new healthcare costs. And so that, in terms of the risk with the state's relationship with the federal government, can't be understated. That being said, the green bar growth is really representing 5 million more people in the state getting healthcare coverage. Today, the Medi-Cal program serves about a third of the state's population. So it's the primary place that Californians of low-income households are getting their health care, and it's been a dramatic change in the state's finances in the last few years. Switching back to the revenue side for a moment, as I mentioned, the personal income tax represents 70% of our revenues. Of that, the top 1% of California taxpayers pay 50% of the personal income tax. And the most volatile aspect of the personal income tax is capital gains. And capital gains are really driven by the stock market. As the stock market rises, particularly in Silicon Valley, we've seen sort of dramatic increases in people's annual income. However, as you can see by the chart, when the stock market crashes, the capital gains crash as well. And those have really been tied to those big red bars that I showed you on the first chart in terms of what's driven state deficits. When the state had sort of no reserves and was relying on this tremendous growth and putting all of the new revenue growth into new permanent services for Californians, this is when the revenues tied to the capital gains dropped. That's where we ended up in the massive deficit modes. And what's concerned us is really, it certainly has been a jagged rise, but the length of the rise of the capital gains over the last number of years has been surprising. And that's tied to the fact that we haven't had a recession lately. This chart shows that if we get through this, this current fiscal year, we'll have tied the longest economic period of growth that we've sort of seen since the post-World War II era. So one of the things that the Brown administration is really focused on is talking about recessions and trying to plan for them. So previous to our administration, people sort of like to think that whatever was happening right now would continue in perpetuity. And so we've sort of tried to remind people that we live in a world of economic cycles and that things don't last forever. And so while the economy continues to do quite well right now, we are always concerned that at some point here, whether it's a trade war, a stock market crash, or some other event, is likely to cause the nation and the state to go into a recession as well. And so we've tried to do some more planning to address that issue. The first thing we've really focused on is building up the state's piggy bank. We call that a rainy day fund in government speak. And the voters passed Proposition 2 in 2014 that the legislature and the governor had put on the state ballot to really, for the first time, have a strong rainy day fund that helped us think about preparing for the future. When revenue started dropping, you would have a source of income to come back to dip into, to help sort of get you through the rough times. And so what we did is we took a system that originally was really, there were some rules for putting the money into the rainy day fund, but there were no rules that restricted taking the money out. And so what happened is there was a very minor buildup of revenues, $1.5 billion in 2007 in the state's rainy day fund. And then even before the real recession began, they pulled all the money out thinking that they needed it to balance their budget because they had rolled over so many deficits. And so when the recession came, there was nothing there to sort of help buffer the worst of the budget cuts or the need for tax increases. And so what we've done over the last 5 years is build the rainy day fund up to its maximum level that the Constitution provides, which is 10% of state revenues. And so now, as we sit here today, we've got $14 billion in the bank for the first time. That being said, we've also really sort of done some recession planning to think about, okay, what's the state's revenue situation likely to look like in the case of a recession? This is something the state had never done before, at least publicly. And so what we did several years ago was start publishing these graphs, which are really sort of designed to, if we have a moderate recession, this is not as severe as the recession we just came out of, nor is it the most mild recession. However, you see the red line, sort of the drop in revenues that we could see in the case of sort of your average recession, which would be over $20 billion a year for probably a 2 or 3 year period. Now, if you're doing the math in your head, I just told you there's $14 billion in the bank in a rainy day fund and a drop of $20 billion for 2 or 3 years, so you could easily get up to $50, $60 billion of lost revenue. So it's not, I think that captures the notion that the rainy day fund is not your one solution to the state's finances. You're not gonna get in a situation where we hit a massive recession and people go, oh great, we don't have to do anything because we can just pull the money out of our piggy bank. That being said, one of the toughest things in our past recessions is that revenues were dropping faster than people realized, and they didn't have any time to do any planning. So this is going to be, from a budget person's perspective, this will be really interesting. The next time we get into a recession is how the state sort of uses this piggy bank as kind of a buffer to do some planning in terms of waiting out the recession. So you're not going to be able to rely on it solely, but it does give you time to put in place budget cuts that may take some longer time to actually start generating their savings, or if you decide you want to go back to the voters and ask for taxes, you have time for those things to be put in place and start generating the revenues that they're intended. So really, I think those are the key pieces of where we are 8 years later, that we sort of eliminated the $27 billion. We started thinking about, okay, what comes next? How do we address the next recession? But that being said, we still have some massive challenges as a state. Mark mentioned the housing crisis. That certainly is something that we've sort of viewed in line with our poverty programs. But I think the most important thing is really the deteriorating relationship with the federal government, that the federal government is so huge from a fiscal perspective to the state of California that in a world in which you're on completely different pages, the system of federalism just doesn't work. And so I talked about the risk of Medicaid if the feds were to cut that. The federal tax reform that passed last year really seemed targeted at states like California by capping the amount of state and local taxes that can be deducted on your income taxes. So that's something to watch going forward in terms of, does that affect the makeup of our taxpayer base, because people aren't able to deduct some of our higher taxes here in California. So that's something to think about for the long term. In terms of poverty, the Census Bureau came up with a new poverty measure several years ago that tried to capture the cost of housing within that measure. And when you measure poverty that way, California is sort of the most impoverished state in the union. And so the legislature and the governor have really taken that seriously the last few years as they've had the opportunity because of the balanced budget. Overall, we've added over $20 billion of new sort of anti-poverty programs to try to help kind of the poorest Californians among us. Chief among that is the expansion of healthcare coverage, as I mentioned, to 5 million new Californians. We also created a state earned income tax credit that sort of goes along with the federal tax credit that's been in place for many years, as well as raising the minimum wage. So the minimum wage was $10 several years ago, and we're now on a path to raising it to $15, with an opportunity to sort of pause those increases if either the economy or the state budget get out of whack. So those are sort of the core things that the state legislature and the governor have focused on to try to address this rising income inequality and rising poverty within the state. In addition, you'll hear more about the pension liabilities this afternoon, but it is something that we've focused a lot of attention on. In total, the state sort of had $35 billion of budget-related borrowing sort of at the peak of the recession. We've whittled that down to less than $5 billion based on a real commitment to try to reduce our budgetary borrowing. That being said, we still have hundreds of billion dollars of retirement-related benefits liabilities. So these are related to government employees, teachers, state workers, in terms of the benefits that are promised to them when they work for government. And that combined with their health, you'll hear as well about unfunded retiree health liabilities. And so that's the health care that we promise retirees after working for government for 20 or 30 years. So in total, those liabilities are $270 plus billion. They've been rising, and that's unfortunate, but some of that rising liabilities is of our own doing, that we sort of, as a state, recognize the fact that people are living longer, faster than necessarily the retirement systems we're recommending, and so that increased our liability. We also reduced the expectation of our future investment returns from 7.5% to 7%, so that's been driving up our liabilities. But when we came into office, there was really no plan in place to deal with these liabilities. And as Governor Brown leaves office, you can say the exact opposite, that there's a plan in place to pay off all of the liabilities over the next 30 years. And that's 30 years is obviously a long time, but that's sort of the landscape that the pension world thinks about. And so, whereas the teachers' retirement system in particular was headed towards complete insolvency in 2014, we put in place a plan where we're on a path to get that fund back up to 100% funded. And so that obviously takes more dollars. That really some of the only tools you have in place to get a retirement system back in place is either paying more or reducing benefits. And so the pension reform that was put in place for 2013 was really the side of reducing benefits, that all new workers coming on board starting in 2013 have a reduced liability, a reduced benefit package, and that over time will reduce our obligations, but it takes time until the workforce kind of turns over to get the long-term benefits of that changing workforce. And then a couple more just to highlight. Climate change, we've already sort of started to see some of the fiscal impacts of global warming in terms of the wildfires that we've seen, as well as I think longer term we'll probably see even greater fiscal impacts of the drought, rising sea levels. Those type of things are areas where the state is really kind of the one best positioned, given its resources, to do some statewide planning and hopefully drive the federal government to follow along to sort of start changing the factors leading to climate change. And then finally, our infrastructure. Obviously, I don't have to say much to people who live in this area regarding our roads, the amount of traffic. So we basically, at the gas tax is the state's primary source of revenue for transportation. We did just raise the gas tax to basically bring it back up to 1994 levels, adjusted for inflation. And so that's one of the measures that you'll be seeing if you haven't already voted on Tuesday's ballot. Proposition 6 is sort of a referendum on the transportation package that we put in place that really focuses on enhancing funding for public transportation as well as providing a new source of revenue, the increased gas tax for dealing with our aging roads. That's an additional liability that the state has started to acknowledge, the deferred maintenance on our roads and highways and bridges, whereas 10 years ago, 8 years ago, people didn't really even talk about the fact that we were avoiding putting money into our maintaining our infrastructure. And that's, again, something that we've changed over the last number of years, is at least at a starting point quantifying those liabilities that we have by not sort of pursuing strong fiscal policy. And so our philosophy has really been, well, at least document the liabilities that we're racking up as a starting point. Otherwise, you're never going to put in place a plan to pay them down. And so in many cases, we first started with documenting those liabilities, and now we've sort of moved to starting to whittle down those liabilities that were built up over many decades, and we've sort of taken the philosophy that you're not going to solve them overnight, but we certainly have tried to do our best by whittling them down. So with that, let me stop and.
Thanks so much. That was great. Okay, so the plan is I'll have a few questions, and then the next session starts at 10:30. So I'll have a few questions, and then go to the audience for some questions. So if you have, I see one already. So I'll come, Chris. So I've got you on the line, but let me just ask a couple of questions first, and then we'll open it up. So thanks. That was a really great presentation, and it's interesting right now because there are sort of conflicting signals in terms of how the economy is doing. So if you look, I think this morning, the most recent jobs report indicated in the country, 250,000 jobs were created. You know, that is like a really strong jobs report. I haven't dug into the details of it, but it sounds like there were also impressive wage gains in there. So it sounds like the economy is doing really well, though of course we've seen the stock market has not been doing so well. So who knows exactly what's on the horizon. I did read something recently that Australia went 27 years without a recession, so it would be nice if we could beat their streak here in the U.S. As well. But I'm curious. You referred a bit to the changes at the federal level in policy over the last in recent times, and one that you didn't refer to, well, you mentioned a bit, was the tax reform. Mm-hmm. And so in California now, basically as of 2018, the deductibility of state and local taxes is severely constrained. How much, and right now California stands out as the state with the highest top marginal rate, and how much of a concern is that, in the sense that if you were paying that 13.3% top marginal rate in 2017, it was effectively 8%, given the deductibility of from your federal income tax burden. It's now 13.3, so it's like a 70% increase. How is that a big issue for the state going forward?
Yeah, I think it's certainly something that makes people like me nervous, and that we need to watch it. That being said, California's always had very high marginal income tax rates, and we've never really seen a large exflow of kind of the millionaires and the extremely high wealthy people out of California. They tend to sort of come to California or be born here in California. So that's something that to date we've been very lucky on, but it's also something we need to be very concerned about going forward. That one of the things that I think was most concerning to business owners and folks in California during the times of our budget deficits was the sort of concern that we didn't know what the policies were going to be in the state. So one of the things that we've been able to change the last few years is to create at least a stable environment for which businesses to operate in California. And I think that's really one of the keys, that people sort of know what their taxes are going to be and can do some planning. Obviously, nobody likes to pay taxes, but California has had enough sort of benefits to where people to date have really stayed in the state. But it's something that I mentioned, the top 1% pay half of the personal income tax. It's really, of that, the top 15,000 taxpayers in California pay 25% of the income tax. So we're really kind of focused on those folks that if we started to see a migration out of California from just a small number of the top 15,000, you would start seeing kind of a revenue decline. So it's something you don't want to ignore, but to date, we haven't really seen any evidence that people are going to flee California.
Okay, great. So one of the first slides you put up showed the budget deficit by year, and I'm sort of thinking of the analogous version of that at the federal level. You have deficits of, let's say, 300 billion or 400 billion, and you see the debt at the federal level change from one year to the next. Yeah. Is there a easy place to see if California if it ran those deficits during that period, has that debt accumulated and is it visible somewhere, or were there, you know what I mean? Like we had a $40 billion deficit, for example, in 2009 to 10, 20 billion the next year, 25 the year after that. So where did that go?
Yeah, from a federal, if we were doing federal budgeting here in California, my job would have been the easiest in the world because you just roll things over, you just let numbers continue to grow endlessly, and you sort of walk away and say, no problem, I'll just print some more money. But California's state budget has to be balanced every year. Other than sort of these gimmicks and sort of deferring costs, at times we've borrowed from various special funds to sort of help balance the budget by bringing money that's not really allowable to be spent for general purposes. We take a loan and bring it onto the general fund. So back in 2011, 2012, the governor sort of coined a term, the wall of debt, and that was where you saw the budgetary borrowing racked up. It was at its peak, it was $35 billion. The bulk of that was really sort of voter-authorized bonds, the economic recovery bonds that were authorized right when Governor Schwarzenegger came into office. Those are now, that type of financing is prohibited now as kind of the trade-off. But we sort of started with $35 billion and whittled it down to less than $5. So it was one of those things that you wouldn't have been able to sort of see in the budget except if you knew where to look. But it was something that the governor, in wanting to sort of level with the voters, really highlighted that, okay, here's the accumulation of the debt over the last number of years. And every year since then, sort of in the budget documents, we've had a chart that lists all of them and it's kind of how much we've paid off. So you sort of have that tracking, but otherwise it was kind of buried deep in the bowels of state budgeting.
Great. Okay. Well, it is, but it's not like I should add up those numbers across years. In other words,
no. It's so you end up sort of paying them off and one way or the other balancing your books for the year. Okay. Sometimes through borrowing, which would add to it, but
that's good.
Yeah.
So we have less debt than that would be if you interpreted it the way like CBO produces figures like that for the federal government. And so if I took the CBO approach for federal deficits to sort of estimate the federal debt, it wouldn't work here.
Right. No, on a budgetary sort of basis, we're in balance for the foreseeable future as long as we don't have a recession.
Right. Okay. Good. We're going to hear about that, I think, in the next in the next session. I was interested to see you highlight Medi-Cal health spending. It looks like it is now, as you noted, about a third of the state is now getting their health insurance through Medi-Cal. But the spending, it's interesting. If you look 2012-13, $49.5 billion, 2018-19, $104.4 billion, so more than doubled over that period. And most of that was ACA. Yeah. But it was striking to me that the federal, most of that, vast majority of that was the federal spending. Has that, do you think, been a boon to sort of local governments? Because to some extent, I'm guessing local governments had to eat some of the cost of treating low-income uninsured previously. I don't know, what's your sense?
Yes, so county government in California are the ones responsible for indigent health care, kind of those that just sort of come into the emergency room. And so we sort of recognized that when we were making the decision to expand Medicaid. We actually, the state for years had been giving counties extra money to cover their indigent care, and we came up with a formula that tried to recapture those funds from counties to help the state pay for the Medi-Cal expansion. So I think if you ask counties, they would say we took too much. From a state perspective, we'd probably say, well, we didn't quite fully capture all of their indigent care dollars that they're now saving. But we sort of at least tried to adjust for it, and I think we got most of what they're saving.
But you and the state was paying attention to the question of whether Obamacare was going to be repealed.
Yes, absolutely.
That would have had a fiscal impact.
That would have had a devastating fiscal impact because traditionally Medi-Cal with California is shared on a 50% basis, so dollar for dollar. And
feds pay 50, state pays 50.
And so what's been great about Obamacare is that the feds started paying, at the beginning they paid 100%, and they're going to ratchet down to paying 90%, so 9-to-1 instead of 1-to-1. So without those commitments, we would have never been able to afford to do the expansion. So if they sort of backed off of those commitments they made, then we would have some major trouble. At the time, the estimates for plans that were out there were $28 billion annually in terms of sort of a shift from the feds to the state, assuming we kept healthcare coverage the same in this state. So that sort of tells you even more powerful than your average recession, because the average recession was in the $20 billion range. So more than that, and not just in a recession, you're at least sort of, okay, this is only going to last 2 to 3 years, but the changes they would have made in healthcare would have been forever. So it sort of would be like the state would be facing a perpetual recession from healthcare spending.
Okay, I've just got one or two more questions before I open it up to the audience. So one has to do with one of your last slides, which was sort of filling up the rainy day fund before the next recession. Yep. So it's nice to see 2014 to 15, we're at 14% of the cap, 32% the next year, 55, 71, we're now at 100%. So what happens to the extent that we continue to have jobs reports with 250,000 jobs, and suppose that the stock market doesn't, it rises substantially, what happens with that money?
Right. So when we were designing the rainy day fund, we probably never thought we would actually get to this point of building up 10%, but we did consider the possibility. And so what we did was we said, okay, any amount that you would normally put into the rainy day fund instead has to be spent on infrastructure. So, and this year the legislature sort of passed a law that sort of divvies up, if we're lucky enough to have another couple years, where the money will go infrastructure-wise. So a lot of it will go to deferred maintenance. The rest of it kind of gets split between affordable housing spending and the high-speed rail. So it's sort of the notion was that we don't want, the whole point of the rainy day fund was not to, was to sort of prevent us spending these large spikes in capital gains on permanent new programs. And so we didn't want, if the rainy day fund ever got filled, you didn't want to use the extra money to then pour into new permanent spending programs. So instead, infrastructure is something you can spend more one year versus another easily, whereas a lot of state programs, once you sort of reach a level of spending, it's hard, you're either cutting someone off from benefits or having to create waiting lists for programs. And so infrastructure is one of the few things in the state that we can sort of modulate year to year. And so that was why we kind of thought to, if we were lucky enough to be in this situation, that the funding would have to be spent on infrastructure.
Okay, great. And my last question is, you have a new role now, CalPERS, right. Public pensions, state, how are we doing?
We're doing better. It's certainly, I don't think we're not in a crisis mode, but we're certainly in an area where governments need to be focused on this and have plans in place to deal with pension liabilities. I think from the state perspective, I mentioned pension reform. That'll be huge in, say, 20 years where the entire workforce is turned over. So from a government perspective, you're really kind of trying to get from today to, say, 20 years down the road, which is a semi-long-term plan. From a state perspective, what we've done is we made an extra contribution to our pension system of about $6 billion a couple of years ago by pooling together some of our cash on hand. And so the cash on hand was earning roughly 0.5% to 1% a year as short-term cash does. And by giving it to the pension fund, we're sort of able to earn much higher interest rates on those investments. And so the pension systems really only work by putting aside money now, investing them to where you can earn more than 1% to 2% a year, and sort of pay, rather than having government or the employee pay, have the investment returns pay. And so from a state perspective, we're up above 70% funded, which at one point we were down in the low 60s. So we're making progress. We have plans in place that will get us back to 100% over the next several decades. But it's certainly not an issue that you would want to completely ignore, that you need to pay attention to it and continue to make your payments every year. One of the things that got us into trouble was back in 2000 when we had the dot-com boom, was the notion that, we have so much money and our pensions funds are fully funded, and so we can stop paying entirely, not recognizing the fact that that year workers were working, earning benefits, and we weren't contributing a dime to pay for their future benefits. And so that's now prohibited under state law from ever doing that again. So I think we've learned a lot of lessons in pension land, and sort of are on a path to where if things hold, that we'll be able to get back to a fully funded system.
Great, okay. So thanks very much. So now I'm just going to open it up for questions. I know, Chris, you have a question back there, and then I'll try to get some more.
Chris Redlick, retired person in one of the 15,000. Looking for somewhere else to go. My concern is, and I don't mind paying the highest tax rates in the country. What I am concerned about is what I get for them. Or not so much what I get for them, but what the general populace of the state gets for them. Yeah. If we're at the bottom end of schools, and we're at the bottom end of infrastructure, and I don't know where we stand on policing and 2 or 3 other areas. There are key services that the state provides and distributes amongst this population. How do the politicians reconciling being number 1 on one end and number 50 on the other?
I mean, I think it's concerning that people always want our programs to work better, because I agree with you that for the amount of taxes that our top 15% or top 15,000 pay, we should have better services in this state. That being said, it takes time for improvement. So I think our education financing system, we've done a lot of changes in the last few years, but even if we nailed it perfectly, it would probably take an entire generation of students going through our K-12 system for you to really see the benefits of that. So we've changed to the Common Core educational system, which sort of is a new way of teaching our students. We're now focusing more on kind of either college readiness or work readiness. So getting back to the notion that, okay, we need to prepare our students for colleges and universities. We need our university systems to be more cost-effective in graduating students, not just admitting students into the system. And also recognizing that not everyone's going to go to a college or university. So we certainly, and I think I could go through almost every policy area in the state, and we've put changes in effect to try to make them more effective and try to get sort of more bang for our buck. But I think in almost all the cases, I would sort of end up coming back to say, we think we've put things on the right path, but whether or not they're going to be entirely effective, it's probably too soon to tell. That government takes a while to implement changes, and sort of for all of those things to flow through, you've got to be a little patient. But I do think we've certainly, the ability to stabilize our education system. Back 7 years ago, we were laying off 30,000 teachers. Today, at least, school districts can plan for their expenses and have a chance to put in place educational programs that will be there for the long haul. So that's kind of probably not the most satisfying answer to you sitting there, but it's an honest one where we recognize the problem, and things take some time to make improvements.
Yeah, question right here.
Yeah, I'm going to pile on. You paint a very rosy picture. But I was just writing down a couple of things. One is where I think we're the number 50 out of 50 states in terms of business unfriendliness, which you talk about great business, but the fact is we are 50 out of 50 as I understand it. You talk about pensions. Honestly, I don't know what we're really fundamentally done on pensions. And I've seen Gina here. She, at Rhode Island, they've made a much more fundamental change. We talked a good game about doing something. We frankly haven't done almost anything, in my opinion. You talk about corrections as small, and other folks talk about corrections. I think we spent something like $100,000 per incarcerated in person in there, which is crazy. DMV doesn't work. So I actually have to say, other than passing a quote-unquote temporary tax increase, which is not temporary as you know, I'm not quite sure what the state has really accomplished under the last 8 years.
Let me try to hit some of those. Corrections, we sort of have, our budget has largely been flat over the last 5-6 years, which it actually is. And so in government where the budget is growing, by keeping something flat, you're actually, in essence, shrinking its relevant share of the state budget. And we've done that by, the voters have several times kind of authorized changes in policy that will reduce the prison population. That being said, there's still a lot to be done, and we still have thousands of inmates out of state, which drive up our costs. That you can't even have a conversation about closing a prison within the state when we're contracting out for more beds out of state. Pension-wise, we have something here that the courts have said that sort of gets termed the California rule, because California's the courts have been much more aggressive in protecting pensions than anywhere else in the country. So what was done in Rhode Island and in other states just historically wouldn't have flied here. So what we did in 2012 in pension reform was, under the operation of law at the time, we sort of went as far as was viewed as conceivable under the legal framework. Now, there are some cases going through that are sort of challenging traditional notions of the California rule, and whether or not over time there's more flexibility to make changes, we'll see. But the key there was we really pushed back the age of retirement. So now, whereas the standard age for a government worker was 55, it's now 62. So that's a pretty dramatic change, and particularly in retirement, when you are retiring at 62 instead of 55, you've obviously shrunk 7 years of time that you're paying a pension, as well as getting people closer to age 65 when they become eligible for Medicare. So you have the double benefit of reducing your pension costs and reducing your health care costs, because you're getting them closer to Medicare age. So those are a couple examples. Obviously, I think I could argue individually on each program. We certainly haven't nailed state government. There's plenty to be done. There's plenty of challenges for the next governor to tackle. But given the political kind of environment that we've operated under, I feel like I could argue that we've pushed things pretty far to make government more manageable, and tried to make improvements across all the policy areas.
Alan?
Do your budget projections include paying for the high-speed train? And if not, how do you plan to pay for it?
Yeah. So they do, in the sense that originally how this project got funded was through $10 billion of general obligation bonds. So we do sort of project the sale of those bonds. The rest of high-speed rail to date has largely been from cap and trade revenues, which is sort of a program where we're capping emissions and businesses have to buy credits if they don't meet that level, and then sort of the auction proceeds we've committed to high-speed rail. Those two sources alone aren't going to be enough to get the project funded. And I should say cap and trade is not a general fund program, so it's sort of excluded from most of the charts I was showing. So, I mean, I think for high-speed rail, the bottom line is ultimately the federal government's going to have to commit more money to the train to make it successful. They gave us $3 billion at the front end, but it's a $60, $70 billion project, knowing what we know now, to get completed. And no major transportation project in this country has ever been completed with such a low ratio of federal to state funds. So without the federal government coming in to kick in additional dollars, it probably is going to very much struggle to find a way to get completed and pay for itself. But we certainly have acknowledged those costs and sort of said, okay, there's a gap here in funding. And there's been few transportation projects of this magnitude that have ever sort of had every dollar in the bank at the front end to pay for them. So it's kind of the way the transportation projects historically have been paid for, that you get them going and then the state, the federal government sort of kick in as you go. But it's certainly one of the major challenges looking ahead in transportation to figure out a way to come up with the extra money to complete the project.
2 more questions, and we're not going to get through all of them. Secretary Schultz, and then right here. Secretary Schultz.
You pointed out that Medicare expenses are exploding. I think that's true all over the country. Many people think, including me, that the basic reason is that healthcare providers do not post prices and outcomes. And the buyers of healthcare have insurance. So there's no buyer and there's no seller. The seller just charges whatever they want, and the buyer is covered by insurance, so they don't care. That's a formula for an exploding cost. So why not require providers to post prices and outcomes and give the buyers health savings accounts instead of insurance? Then you have a market with a buyer and a seller in it, and you have a chance of getting prices under control.
I mean, I agree completely with your analysis of the problem. So it's a matter of, I think, the political will to make those kind of changes has been lacking so far in this country. That obviously the healthcare industry is strong. People are on the buyer side are used to having what they want and don't want to give it up. And so you've sort of had a formula to where everyone that has health insurance is happy enough with it that no one's had the political willpower to make the changes to have sort of a dramatic change in the program. So I think eventually you would need to make those changes, because obviously you can't have healthcare increase at 5-7% every year when your economy is only growing at 2 to 3%. It just doesn't work. Eventually it becomes kind of all-consuming within your budget and within your economy. And so we just haven't hit the point where people sort of have enough of a crisis point, I think, to make the dramatic changes within the healthcare industry.
I'm happy that we have a student from the School of Medicine here, so hopefully she's internalizing all of this and will bring these great ideas to the system when she becomes a physician. One more question right here.
Well, considering on the 2020 ballot, most likely they're going to look to overturn Prop 13 for commercial property. I'm not sure that really gives businesses in the state, a stable environment and will improve our 50-place ranking. But my question more is along the lines of local governments and your position at the LAO and current position at CalPERS probably, and at the state, give you some insight. And I'm sure you're acutely aware that unfunded pension liabilities are causing great budget stress now and will continue to get worse over time, and it's not going to be possible to tax their way out of it. So to think that everybody's going to get paid 100% of what they're owed, I think is naive. So, I mean, how does multiple city bankruptcies in the next recession impact the state of California, and why is that completely being ignored?
You have 1 minute.
Gotcha.
So good luck.
So let me start by saying, yes, local governments have much more pension stress than the state. And the reason for that is twofold. One is a lot of state money is a pass-through to local government. So there aren't really employees for every dollar in the budget. And whereas at the local government level, more of the dollars are being spent on employees than at the state. Combined with that, local governments employ sort of public safety individuals in police and fire, and those folks retire earlier, they have higher pension benefits. And so combined, those two things have really put local governments under more pressure. It's worth reminding local governments that they were the ones who chose to provide the pension benefits that they did. So I think from a state perspective, we've always sort of had an arm's length relationship with local governments when they go into bankruptcy. That I think the discussion when pension benefits were increased in 2000 from CalPERS was absolutely wrong. That the notion that, oh, you can have these benefits for free was inappropriate at the time. That being said, local governments all afterwards made decisions to increase the benefits, and they. So
we should probably. So you guys can, at the break, we've got a break coming up because we've got a great session coming after this. So please join me in thanking Michael Cohen for his session. Okay, great. Thanks, Michael.